What's the worst thing you've seen someone do at a funeral? My friend's 11-month-old son died. It was a really hard funeral to go to, obviously, but the pastor who was speaking kept saying the dad's name instead of the baby's name. Like, dad's name is James and baby's name is Ryan. The pastor kept going on about how James was such a happy baby. James was always smiling. Finally the mom, furious, corrected him. It was awful. At my grandfather's viewing, my family is all standing near the casket, in a sort of receiving line. This woman walks up. I have never seen her before in my life. Dabbing at her eyes and sniffling. She looks up at me, then smiles. I then realize that she is currently not crying, nor is there any evidence that she has been crying. She opens her mouth and shakes her head, still smiling. He just doesn't look like himself, she said, as I ball my hands into fists. Before I could say or do anything to her, my 6'5", 300-pound uncle steps in, ushering her along. He simply shook his head in response, replying, "Yeah, he's not feeling so hot either." It was later confirmed that my uncle also had no clue who on earth this woman was, and neither did the rest of the family. Needless to say, the fake crying still creeps me out. Nearly 13 years later. Funeral crashes. They check the obituaries for funerals and attend. Why? Who knows for sure? Free food like party crashes or a strange desire to be in the midst of other people's misery. But there really are people who do this. Selfie with the body in the casket. Not the worst thing commented here, but this happened at my grandmother's funeral last year, and I still get kind of mad remembering it. Sorry if this is lengthy. I attended with my mom, uncle, brother, and grandpa, ex-husband of my grandma. I didn't recognize anyone else there, which was sorta expected, since my grandma would visit us on holidays and I'd never really been to her house. As my family arrived, we were all looked at by some as the strangers that nobody recognized. Yeah, okay. Viewing and stuff went by as expected. Then we went to the gravesite to watch her casket be lowered. As we were seated for final words, this old woman, who claimed to be my grandmother's best friend, behind me goes quite rudely and somewhat loud, "I don't know who these people in front of us are. We should be sitting there. Who are they?" There were literally pictures of us all over my grandma's house. When it was time for close relatives to throw the dirt and roses, we stood up, and she made some other comment. Back at the mortuary after party, I went over and introduced myself and pointed out my family. The lady then acted like she was so happy to meet me that she feels like she loves me like a granddaughter too. That my grandma talked about me and my brother often. It felt very fake. It just made the day so much harder for me. There was an open mic thing at my aunt's funeral where anyone could come up and share stories or nice things about her, etc. Anyways, this weird, middle-aged man gets up and starts reading poetry he wrote that had absolutely nothing to do with her. It was so awkward. No one knew what to do about it. Interrupt the funeral to escort him out. Longest few minutes of my life struggling with humor at the absolute absurdity of it versus, mourning my aunt. He finally did leave the mic to someone else, just as my cousin was almost out of his chair to hurry him along. But not before letting everyone know the name of his website if they wanted to hear more. Yikes. My uncle came to my grandma's funeral drunk off his ass and very nearly knocked the casket off its stand. It was a pretty awful scene to watch unfold. One of my best friends died a few months ago after he lost his battle to leukemia. He was an avid outdoorsman, so we had his funeral outside at a state park. Our boss decided to come, which is fine. She also brought her dog with her. She answered a phone call while my friend's son was giving a speech about his father. She also asked a co-worker to change her speech last minute to include that she be in it by saying if he survived his cancer he would have been promoted. And to top it off, his son is a cop and he always wanted a ride along. After the service they put his ashes in the front seat, hit the sirens, pulled away. It was a really emotional moment. My boss's dog was ducking, barking and going apeshit. and she wonders why nobody respects her. A friend of mine's mom ran out on the family when one afternoon she just drove to the airport and flew to another state to be with a guy she met online. 8 years later, his dad died in a car accident. His mom, who he hadn't seen or spoken to since she left, came to the funeral and proceeded to spend the entire reception complaining to everyone how hard her life was. My mother-in-law pissed herself and chugged a bottle of hot sauce. Saw some kid dressed like a horse. The girlfriend showed up. The wife had to have her grown sons escort her out. It wasn't someone. It was me. I was at a relative's funeral. Now in my religion the thing you do is you shake hands going from right to left. So I followed the crowd and did that. Now when shaking hands you don't stay silent. It's awkward. So the people I shook hands with would tell me God bless you, and the thing you can reply to that is to you too, or same to you anyways. You get what I mean. Now the problem happened when I got to the deceased's father. He was really affected and didn't say anything. Keep in mind it's a long line, so I've been saying to you too to multiple people, so I've just been saying it out of habit without waiting for them to say anything. I told the father to you too, and he looked at me in disgust. I just wished death on him at his son's funeral. Too long didn't read. I wished a father death at his own son's funeral. A kid playing Pokemon Go. Well, that's one way to catch a ghost type. The Palbras had a pool noodle fight before carrying the casket. I may have been one of them. My friend's sister was going through a hard time and unfortunately decided to take her own life. At the funeral, her elderly parents were taking up a collection for funds to bury her, since her death was unexpected and she didn't have much money. Anyway, her deadbeat, abusive, useless ass, estranged husband showed up and tried to take the money for himself. At the funeral, kept screaming, literally screaming. Mind you, I need this money. I need it for bills. I need it. Both the pastor and her elderly parents had to stop him from running off with it. He then proceeded to ask them for money because, hey, 80-year-old people are just loaded that way. They declined, of course. But the damage had been done. What a horrible situation. Not the worst, but at my stepdad's funeral some random 20-year-old kid showed up in pajama pants and just ate the food and left. I was so ducking pissed. My grandmom's mom passed away. As a Presbyterian she wasn't that holy roller type, but she was an elder in her church and Christian in her beliefs. Her only son, my uncle, was much more fundamentalist and had previously been a part-time preacher in a much more evangelical Baptist church. So he ended up really pissing my mom and her sister off when he spoke at their mom's funeral to proselytize some and try to use his mom's funeral to claim she would have wanted people to be called to Christ at her funeral. It's been a long time, so I can't remember the specific eulogy sermon contents, but I do remember my then soft-spoken mom being pissed at his attempt and mischaracterizing of their mom's religious beliefs. At my grandmother's funeral, her niece, who was known for being a dysfunctional drunk mess and pretty much disowned by the family, was caught stealing floral arrangements. Since she hadn't been around our close family for years, she didn't know who she was talking to when my brother-in-law found her out back loading them into her van. She told him they were sent for her, but he knew better. Basically him and my dad ended up taking the flowers back and forcing her to leave. They didn't tell anyone until later that evening, once the funeral was over and we were sorting through all of the arrangements. I work in a funeral home, and I usually enjoy my job. The worst day ever, though, was when this family, that was the definition of white trash, showed up. A lot of them didn't even know whose funeral it was. Everyone was outside smoking heavily. They had young kids out there with them. It was 50 plus at a time. They even set an ashtray on fire. It got so bad that my boss told me to stop opening the door for them for my own health. My job is literally holding open the door. That's all I do. We knew this family was trash beforehand, since the last funeral they held resulted in a fight in the parking lot, but this was just disgusting. Buddy of mine committed suicide not long after he tried to get back with his ex-wife and things once again didn't work out. His ex-wife went to his funeral with her new fiance. Flirting with me. Forcing a sad face so women will think that he's so sensitive. Also, someone else talked about a strip club and how hot the girls are there. In another funeral, my uncle said, hey, Mary Lama and her brother's grandmother died 2 weeks ago. They have 2 grandmother funerals in 2 weeks. Ha 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 ha. I blame it on nervousness. But come on. Other funeral, a man came drunk as duck and smelled very strongly like alcohol. I've been to 4 funerals in my life. So yeah, I've only been to 1 normal funeral. I hate it when people laugh out of nerves. My step-grandmother's funeral. Several of her grandkids, no relation to me, were allowed by their parents to mess with her appearance, smudged her makeup, duck up her collar hair, and played with her necklace. I was 8 and these kids were about my age. My mom came up after a few minutes and just couldn't believe it, yet also could. I learned that day that my mom had no nice things to say about her step family except grandma. She was good people. Wear flip-flops and a tank top. If that kind of attire is a part of the deceased's usual attire or atmosphere, then I understand. Otherwise it's straight up rude. I'm not asking you to get formal and wear a tux, but you could put on a tie and some laced shoes. My mom wouldn't shut up about how my uncle's drinking problem from 30 years ago caused his death. This, knowing how she told me he sobered up by the time I was born and didn't drink throughout my life. Not at a funeral, but at the get-together at my house after the funeral. Also, I'm glad I didn't hear about this until years after, because I probably would have beaten the wrinkles off of this lady. So after my grandfather's funeral, we had a get-together at my house. Had popers and cake, chocolate and coconut, 2 separate cakes. This was the one and only funeral for my family members I have cried at so far because of the deep connection I had with him. Some lady that disliked my grandfather showed up, and my grandma was surprised, but not angry, when she saw her. According to my grandma, this lady had the audacity to say he is dead, finally, and all my grandmother could do was laugh. When she retold it to us, I could tell that she wasn't happy when it happened. Even though it happened a long time ago, I was still furious at this lady I have never met before, and to this day never saw her before. My maternal grandmother's funeral. My mom has 2 sisters and a brother. One sister lives in California and wasn't sure if she would be able to fly out for the funeral since her BFF was in the middle of dying of cancer. Siblings all understood, told her to do what she needed to do, etc. They'd take care of things. She decided she would be able to come out, showed up to the funeral, and got in my mom's face screaming about how dare my mom not tell her where the funeral would be. At the funeral, brother tried to calm her down by talking to her privately, but she just screamed at him. She got escorted out of the funeral home, and the brother-in-laws went to grandma's house to keep an eye on it just in case. But she just went to her hotel and posted a nasty rant on Facebook about how cathartic it was to scream at the funeral, etc. Bunch of likes from her shitty friends. She managed to return and be decent for the remainder of the service. Afterwards there was a planned lunch for the family at the same restaurant we had all eaten together at recently for my deceased grandma's 80th birthday. Originally Crazy Aunt was invited, but when word of her Facebook rant got to the family she was uninvited. Dinner was paid out of the grandmother's estate. Non-Crazy Aunt and my mom were executors of the estate, and this sort of thing was lined out as approved in the will. Basically even. And Crazy Aunt tried to fight that and wasted more of the estate's money on lawyer's fee than would have been her share of the dinner. And half the dinner was for the older brother family, since he had so many kids, and they had kids etc. So on that side, including the recently passed grandma, they had managed to get to 5 generations. At my granddad's tangi, they were lowering him into the ground, and then the rope broke, so the coffin leaned forward somehow. It was in a standing posture and everyone looked away, and as I looked away I could see the top of my chorus head. It was quite crazy, but they quickly lowered him down and carried on. I was quite upset and shocked, as were most people. Some of my family think that this was a sign that he wanted to be buried somewhere else. His wife, who was my stepman or something, wanted him buried at a certain place, but his side of the family wanted him to be buried with his parents and siblings. So the coffin falling was sign or something. I'm leaving out details to avoid people recognizing the story. A child died. His grandmother made a huge fuss about how much her feet hurt. She ended up taking off her shoes and forcing the grieving parents to tend to her. Consider subscribing if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more of Reddit universe.